Let's talk about tones, color tones. First of all, I would like to make a quick review. From all these four factors that influence the color, we said that hues are some kind of middle points, and in some way we can say that they are on one side and all these three remaining factors are on the other side. If we talk about tones, we can say that the methods that we use to obtain tones are very similar to the methods that we use to obtain tints and shades. So that's why hues are on one side, as they are like clean or pure middle colors, and the tints, tones and shades are on the other side. We can call them not clean or not pure colors, but in fact they are desaturated colors. So if we are adding white or gray or black, in this case we are adding gray as we talk about tones. In one way or another we mix those colors. We talked about the fact that clean colors are actually not so interesting for interiors. That's why we'll have to focus on more complicated or more mixed colors. And tones, it's one more method how we can obtain our colors that we will use in our interior design. We actually use the same method. The only difference is that we use different colors, or we said that black and white are not colors. In this case, if we are talking about tones, we are adding gray, and gray by itself, it's a neutral color. Let's call it color for now. Usually gray in interiors serves like a base color. It allows other elements such as furniture, artwork or accessories to stand out. So in other words, we can call them the most neutral color. That's why tones are usually used for more muted surfaces in interior design. But before we apply tones for our interior design, we have to consider a few things. In interior design, we are moving very like drawing rules. First, we have to draw the general lines or the general shapes. Then we go to the medium elements and only then the details. So that's why when we talk about using tones for our interiors, we will have to follow a few steps. If we would have to draw our interiors like some kind of cartoons, by cartoons I mean some simple surfaces that use only one color. Of course, in this case we are not talking about photorealism. We can say that we can use in this case in some way a ready color palette. But actually when we get to interior design, usually there are more factors that influence the overall appearance in our renders. First of all, it's the light. We are using temperature for our light sources and usually they use a warm tone. Now, first question that appears, warm tone? We said that gray is neutral. A perfect neutral gray, yes. And by the way, in 3ds Max, and not only in Vray, but we are using Vray, our materials start with a neutral gray. And by the way, you can ask why our neutral gray here looks too light. We have our gamma 2.2 enabled. We will talk about this in the next lessons, and this is just one more factor that influences our color in our renders. And that's why in 3ds Max and interior design it's not so simple with just taking some color palettes and applying them to our interiors. But back to our light. If we aim to see something in our renders, we have to turn on the lights. And lights got their own color. Well, we use temperature, but for now we will call it color. And the tones that we are using, in this case we talk about tones, this also applies to tints and shades, got another color mix, despite the fact that gamma 2.2 that we are using distort that clean colors that we use from our color palettes. One more factor that we have to talk about are the textures. If we are talking about our cartoons, we don't use real textures. That's why it's very easy to talk about tones in reality. We can accept somehow that even if our lights, our interior lights will affect the colors, they will still be very close to the palette that we will use. But in this case, we are talking about photos. We are not talking about renders. In some way, we can take an interior color palette and adjust the colors from the palette using fixed colors, for example, for our paint that we will use on our surfaces or maybe on some of the objects. Let's say, for example, we've downloaded a palette. There are thousands and millions of them. Now the biggest question is, how do you apply it in your interior? I exclude here the two simple interiors with one color or something like that. we talk about some level of design that we will use in our interiors. You can just test and then realize that the colors actually don't match as you expected. And that's why you'll have to test that in 3D software first. And getting back to our color tones, we can say that the colors that we will use for our interiors will be first tested and then they will have an additional adjustment. We usually do use saturation to adjust our colors. And when it comes to textures, we usually go to Photoshop and saturate or desaturate our colors. Usually it's desaturation, as we are usually use more often muted colors for our interiors. So getting back to our main question, when and how do we use tones in interior design? First, we always begin with the color palette and the reference. Keep in mind that your gray stage or 3D model stage must be in a balance before we apply our lights and our colors. First, we start by applying the color palette. Yes, it's very important, but it is like a raw stage of our starting point. You'll have to adjust the colors and the textures on your 3D models. And here we start to talk about tones. All the colors and the textures are passing like some kind of adjustment. And this is like a second stage or a filter where we visually appreciate how our colors and materials look together. We have to consider that different materials got different properties as well. We also have not to forget about light. And only then, putting all these in a final mix, we can understand how our final result would look like. So that's why when we talk only about color palettes for interiors, they usually seem like a crude material to work with. So in conclusion, we can say that color tones are very close to interior design, as we usually, in our adjustments, appeal to saturation or desaturation exactly for interiors, as we are not using intensive colors for our interiors, and they usually bring that calm effect to our interiors, and they in some way contribute to the overall color balance in order for some elements not to pump up and create disorder in our overall color balance. Next, we'll talk about our last factor. We will talk about shades.